The autumn of 1885 brought shame to the doorstep of the Whitmore family in ways that would echo through the cobblestone streets of Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania, for generations to come. As the first frost painted the maple leaves crimson and gold, Eleanor Whitmore found herself standing before the oak doors of St. Margaret's Church, her swollen belly a testament to secrets she refused to reveal. The congregation's whispers followed her like shadows, but what they didn't know was that the man whose name she protected would one day return to their small mining town as the most powerful railroad magnate east of the Mississippi. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Little did the good people of Cedar Falls realize that Eleanor's silence wasn't born of shame, but of a love so profound that she would endure exile rather than destroy the reputation of a man who had promised to return for her. And when he finally did, 18 years later, arriving in his private railroad car with enough wealth to buy their entire town twice over, Eleanor's steadfast loyalty would be vindicated in ways that would leave every gossip and moral judge speechless. Eleanor Whitmore had always been different from the other young women in Cedar Falls. While her contemporaries spent their days embroidering samplers and practicing piano scales in preparation for advantageous marriages, Eleanor could be found in her father's bookshop, devouring volumes of poetry and philosophy that most considered unsuitable for a lady's delicate sensibilities. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had encouraged this intellectual curiosity, perhaps because he had never been blessed with sons and saw in his spirited daughter the heir to his love of learning and literature. The Whitmore family occupied a respectable position in Cedar Falls society. Thomas's bookshop served the town's small but growing educated class, while Eleanor's mother, Margaret, was known for her charitable works among the mining families who comprised the majority of the town's population. They lived in a modest but comfortable two-story house on Elm Street, with its white picket fence and rose garden that was Margaret's pride and joy. Eleanor's childhood had been marked by Sunday services at St. Margaret's, community socials at the town hall, and the predictable rhythm of small-town life in post-Civil War America. Everything changed in the spring of 1884, when the Pennsylvania and Western Railroad announced plans to extend their line through Cedar Falls. The news sent ripples of excitement through the community. A railroad connection would mean prosperity, easier transport of coal from the local mines, and connection to the wider world beyond their isolated valley. The town council organized committees to welcome the railroad surveyors and engineers who would be arriving to assess the feasibility of the proposed route. Eleanor first saw him on a Tuesday morning in May, standing outside the town hall with a leather satchel and surveyor's equipment, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the morning breeze. James Mitchell was 26 years old, a graduate of the Pennsylvania Railroad's engineering program, and possessed of an quiet intensity that immediately set him apart from the local young men Eleanor had known all her life. Where they were boisterous and obvious in their courtship attempts, James was thoughtful and observant, more likely to listen carefully to a conversation than to dominate it with his own opinions. Their first meeting occurred when Eleanor was delivering a stack of technical manuals her father had ordered specifically for the railroad men. James was examining a detailed map of the local topography when she entered the temporary office the railroad had established in the back room of Henderson's General Store. When she cleared her throat to announce her presence, he looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds, and Eleanor felt something shift in the carefully ordered world she had always known. "Miss Whitmore, I presume," he said, rising from his chair with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Your father mentioned he had a daughter who shared his love of books. I'm James Mitchell, chief surveyor for this section of the Pennsylvania and Western expansion." Eleanor found herself studying his face as she handed over the technical manuals, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow and the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. "Father thought these might be useful for your work," she managed, surprised by the slight breathlessness in her own voice. "The topographical surveys are quite detailed, though some are several years old." "Older surveys can be invaluable," James replied, accepting the books with hands that Eleanor noticed were both strong and careful. "They show patterns of change over time, geological shifts that might affect foundation work. Your father has excellent instincts about what might be useful." The conversation that followed was unlike any Eleanor had experienced with a young man. James asked her opinion about local geology, listened intently to her observations about seasonal flooding patterns she had noticed during her walks along Cedar Creek, and treated her contributions as genuinely valuable rather than charming. Attempts at female participation in masculine subjects. When she mentioned her interest in the engineering challenges posed by the mountainous terrain, he didn't condescend or change the subject, but instead invited her to examine the surveying equipment and explained how measurements were taken and translated into construction plans. "You have a natural understanding of spatial relationships," he observed, as Eleanor quickly grasped the principles behind the surveying instruments. "Have you ever considered that engineering might benefit from more minds like yours?" The suggestion was so radical, so far outside the boundaries of what was considered appropriate for women in 1884, that Eleanor initially thought he was teasing her. But the serious expression on his face and the genuine respect in his voice convinced her otherwise. For the first time in her life, she was speaking with someone who saw her intellectual curiosity not as an amusing eccentricity to be tolerated, but as a valuable asset to be encouraged. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed with increasing frequency. James would stop by the bookshop to discuss technical problems with Thomas, but his conversations invariably expanded to include Eleanor's perspectives on local conditions and challenges. She began accompanying him on some of his surveying expeditions, ostensibly to show him historical sites and local landmarks, but actually engaging in detailed discussions about engineering solutions and construction challenges. These walks through the countryside surrounding Cedar Falls became the foundation of their deepening relationship. Away from the watchful eyes of the townspeople, James and Eleanor discovered a compatibility that transcended the conventional boundaries of courtship. They talked about everything from literature and philosophy to practical problems of railroad construction. James shared his dreams of one day starting his own railroad company, not just working for others, but creating transportation networks that would connect isolated communities to opportunities and markets. Eleanor found herself contributing ideas about community needs and social impacts that James had never considered, broadening his perspective on what railroads could accomplish beyond mere commercial success. The physical attraction between them grew gradually, built on a foundation of intellectual compatibility and genuine mutual respect. James never presumed upon Eleanor's affections or took liberties that would compromise her reputation. Their romance developed through shared glances during community meetings, brief touches of hands when examining maps or documents, and stolen moments of conversation during social gatherings where they found themselves drawn to each other's company, despite the presence of others. By midsummer, Eleanor had fallen deeply in love with this thoughtful, ambitious man who treated her as an equal partner in conversation and valued her opinions on subjects that most men considered beyond feminine understanding. James, for his part, had discovered in Eleanor not just a beautiful and intelligent woman, but someone whose mind complemented his own in ways that made him believe they could accomplish remarkable things together. The crisis came in August, when James received word that his railroad company was accelerating the construction timeline. Political pressures and financial considerations meant that the Cedar Falls section would need to be completed months earlier than originally planned. James would be transferred to oversee construction in western Pennsylvania immediately, with no guarantee of when he might return to their small town. "I don't want to leave you," he told Eleanor during an evening walk along Cedar Creek, the setting sun painting the water golden around them. "These months in Cedar Falls have been the happiest of my life, and it's entirely because of you." Eleanor felt her heart constrict at the thought of his departure, but she understood the professional demands of his career. "You have to go," she said quietly, though the words felt like physical pain. "This opportunity could lead to everything you've dreamed of accomplishing." James stopped walking and turned to face her directly, his expression intense with emotion. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "Marry me, Eleanor. We could have a wedding before I leave, and you could travel with me. I know it would mean leaving your family and everything familiar, but we could build a life together." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The proposal was everything Eleanor had hoped for and feared in equal measure. She loved James deeply and could envision no future that didn't include him, but the practical realities of their situation created seemingly insurmountable obstacles. "James, I want nothing more than to say yes," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But we both know it's not that simple. You'll be traveling constantly, living in temporary camps and construction sites. That's no life for a wife, especially not initially." "Then what do you suggest?" James asked, though his expression indicated he already feared her answer. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. "Go to Pennsylvania. Establish yourself in your new position. Prove yourself indispensable to the company. Then, when you're in a position to offer stability, come back for me. I'll wait." "How long might that take?" James asked, though he already knew the answer would be measured in years rather than months. "However long it takes," Eleanor replied with a conviction that surprised her with its strength. "I love you, James Mitchell, and I believe in what we could build together. I'm willing to wait for the right time, rather than rushing into a situation that might damage both our futures." They spent their final weeks together, making careful plans for maintaining contact despite the distance and uncertainty ahead. James promised to write regularly and to return as soon as his professional situation allowed for marriage and stability. Eleanor promised to wait for him, to resist pressure from her family and community to consider other suitors, and to guard the secret of their understanding until he could return openly to claim her as his bride. Their last night together was spent in the rose garden behind Eleanor's house, talking until dawn about their hopes for the future and the challenges they would face during their separation. When James finally kissed her goodbye, it was with the passionate intensity of two people who knew they might not see each other for years. "No matter what happens," James whispered against her hair, "remember that I love you and I will come back for you. Nothing will change that." "I know," Eleanor whispered back, memorizing the feel of his arms around her and the scent of his skin. "I'll be waiting." James left Cedar Falls on the morning train in September 1884, and Eleanor watched from her bedroom window as the locomotive carried away the man she loved and the future they had planned together. She had no way of knowing that their separation would last far longer than either had anticipated, or that the greatest test of their love was yet to come. For the first few months after James's departure, Eleanor maintained her composure and optimism through the strength of their correspondence. His letters arrived regularly, filled with detailed descriptions of his work, the challenges he was facing, and constant reassurances of his love and commitment to their future together. Eleanor responded with equally detailed accounts of life in Cedar Falls, careful observations about local developments that might interest him professionally, and her own declarations of unchanging devotion. The letters provided a lifeline of connection that helped Eleanor endure the curious questions from neighbors about why she seemed to have lost interest in the local young men who continued to court her. She deflected these inquiries with vague references to not being ready for marriage and her desire to help her father with the bookshop, explanations that satisfied most questioners while protecting the secret of her understanding with James. By winter, however, the tone of James's letters began to change subtly. The railroad project was proving more complex and politically fraught than anyone had anticipated. Competing interests, financial difficulties, and construction challenges were causing delays and complications that kept him traveling constantly between work sites. His promotion within the company, while professionally advantageous, meant increased responsibilities that made it impossible to predict when he might be able to return to Cedar Falls. Eleanor sensed his growing frustration and uncertainty, but she remained steadfast in her commitment to wait for him. Her love had not diminished during their separation. If anything, the challenges of maintaining their connection across distance and uncertainty had deepened her appreciation for what they shared. She continued to write encouraging letters, offering emotional support and practical suggestions when James shared his professional difficulties. The crisis that would change everything began in early spring of 1885. Eleanor had been feeling unwell for several weeks, experiencing fatigue and nausea that she initially attributed to the stress of James's prolonged absence and her worry about their uncertain future. When the symptoms persisted and intensified, however, she began to suspect a far more serious cause. The realization that she was pregnant hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She sat in her bedroom on a March morning staring at her reflection in the mirror and seeing in her slightly fuller face and changing figure the evidence of a situation that would destroy not only her own reputation, but potentially James's career and future as well. In 1885, an unmarried woman bearing a child was considered the ultimate moral transgression, a scandal that would bring shame not only upon herself, but upon her entire family. The fact that her pregnancy was the result of genuine love and a committed relationship that would have led to marriage under different circumstances would be irrelevant to the moral judgment of their community. What mattered to Cedar Falls society was the appearance of impropriety, the violation of accepted standards, of behavior that governed respectable families. Eleanor's first instinct was to write immediately to James, to share the news and ask him to return for an immediate wedding that would legitimize their child and preserve both their reputations. But as she began composing the letter, she realized the impossible position this would place him in. James was at a crucial point in his career, having just been offered a significant promotion that could lead to the financial security and professional recognition they would need for their future together. Forcing him to choose between his career, advancement, and her immediate needs would be unfair to both of them and potentially destructive to everything they hoped to build together. Moreover, Eleanor understood the practical realities of James's situation. Even if he abandoned his current position to return to Cedar Falls immediately, they would face months of financial insecurity while he sought new employment. Starting their marriage under such circumstances, with a newborn child and the stain of scandal, would create burdens that might ultimately destroy their relationship despite their love for each other. As Eleanor wrestled with these impossible choices, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not tell James about the pregnancy. She would bear this burden alone, protecting both his career and their future by refusing to force him into an untenable situation. When the time was right, when he had achieved the professional stability they both desired, He would return to Cedar Falls as planned, and they would face whatever consequences remained from her choice. To wait. The decision, once made, brought Eleanor a strange sense of peace, despite the enormous challenges she knew lay ahead. Her love for James was strong enough to endure scandal and social ostracism if necessary. She would find a way to protect their child and preserve their future, no matter what personal cost she might have to pay. Eleanor's pregnancy could not remain hidden indefinitely, and by late spring her condition had become obvious to anyone who looked carefully. Her mother, Margaret, was the first to confront her directly about the changes in her appearance and behavior. "Eleanor," Margaret said one morning as they worked together in the rose garden, "we need to discuss what's happening with you. Your father and I are not blind, and the neighbors are beginning to talk." Eleanor had been dreading this conversation, but she met her mother's concerned gaze with as much dignity as she could manage. "I know what you're thinking, Mother, and you're right. I'm going to have a child." Margaret's face went pale, her gardening shears trembling in her hands. "Oh, Eleanor, how could this have happened? Who is the father?" The question Eleanor had been preparing for since she first realized her situation. "I can't tell you that," she said, quietly but firmly. "I won't tell you that. What do you mean you can't tell me?" Margaret's voice rose in pitch and volume. "Eleanor, this is not some romantic novel. This is your life, your reputation, our family's standing in the community. Of course you must tell us who the father is. He has responsibilities, obligations." Eleanor shook her head, her resolve strengthening in the face of her mother's distress. "No, Mother, I will not name him. That's my decision, and nothing you can say will change it." The argument that followed was the most painful conversation Eleanor had ever had with her parents. Margaret wept, pleaded, and finally raged about the disgrace Eleanor was bringing upon their family. Thomas, when he was finally informed of the situation, alternated between gentle attempts at persuasion and stern demands for the truth. Both parents were convinced that Eleanor was protecting some worthless young man who had taken advantage of her innocence and then abandoned her to face the consequences alone. "No decent man would allow you to endure this scandal without accepting his responsibilities," Thomas said during one particularly difficult evening confrontation. "Whoever he is, he's proven himself unworthy of your protection." Eleanor wanted desperately to defend James, to explain that he was unaware of the situation and would undoubtedly return immediately if he knew, but doing so would defeat the entire purpose of her sacrifice. Instead, she endured her parents' disappointment and anger, holding fast to her decision despite the emotional cost. As news of Eleanor's pregnancy spread through Cedar Falls, the reaction was swift and brutal. Women who had previously greeted her warmly on the street now crossed to the other side to avoid speaking with her. Former friends found excuses to end conversations quickly when she approached. The congregation at St. Margaret's made their disapproval known through cold stares and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The moral judgment of their small community was particularly harsh because Eleanor had always been viewed as a respectable, well-educated young woman from a good family. Her fall from grace seemed to confirm the suspicions of those who had always believed that too much education made women dangerously independent and prone to improper behavior. The fact that she refused to name the father only intensified the speculation and gossip. Some townspeople assumed the father was a married man whose reputation Eleanor was protecting out of misguided loyalty. Others speculated that she had been involved with multiple men and was uncertain of paternity. The cruelest rumors suggested that she had been raped but was too ashamed to admit it, while the most charitable assumed she was protecting some young man who had promised marriage but then fled when faced with the consequences of their relationship. Eleanor endured all these speculations in silence, her dignity intact despite the social isolation that gradually surrounded her family. The Whitmore bookshop began losing customers who preferred not to patronize a business associated with scandal. Margaret's charitable activities were curtailed, as other women made it clear that Eleanor's presence at social gatherings was no longer welcome. The pressure on Eleanor to reveal the father's identity intensified as her pregnancy progressed. Community leaders, including the pastor of St. Margaret's, visited the Whitmore home to urge Eleanor to do the right thing and identify the man responsible for her condition. Each visitor was met with the same polite but immovable refusal. "I understand your concern," Eleanor would say to each delegation of moral authorities, "but I will not name him. That is my final word on the matter." As autumn arrived and Eleanor's pregnancy entered its final months, the situation reached a crisis point. The continued scandal was affecting not only Eleanor, but her entire family. Thomas's business was suffering significantly, and Margaret had been forced to resign from her positions in several charitable organizations. The social ostracism was taking a visible toll on both parents, aging them visibly and straining their marriage as they disagreed about how to handle their daughter's situation. The final confrontation came on a cold October evening when Thomas delivered an ultimatum that Eleanor had been dreading but expecting. "Eleanor," he said with visible anguish, "your mother and I love you dearly, but we cannot continue to endure this situation indefinitely. The scandal is destroying everything we've worked to build in this community." Eleanor felt her heart stop as she anticipated what was coming next. "If you will not name the father and resolve this situation properly," Thomas continued, his voice breaking with emotion, "then you can no longer remain in our home. We cannot watch our family be destroyed by your stubborn refusal to do what any reasonable person would consider the right thing." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows, though she had been preparing herself for this possibility for months. "You're casting me out," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain coursing through her. "We're giving you one final opportunity to make the right choice," Margaret said through her tears. "Tell us who the father is, and we'll make arrangements for a proper marriage, or at least proper support for the child. Continue to protect this man who has clearly abandoned you, and yes, you will have to leave." Eleanor looked at her parents, seeing in their faces the genuine anguish her situation had caused them, and felt a moment of wavering resolve. It would be so easy to name James, to explain the circumstances, to end this nightmare with a few words. But doing so would destroy everything they had planned together, would force him to choose between his career and her immediate needs at the worst possible time. "I cannot name him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will not name him. If that means I must leave, then I accept that consequence." Thomas turned away, unable to look at his daughter as he pronounced what felt like a death sentence. "Then you have 1 week to make arrangements for your departure. We'll provide some money to help you get established elsewhere, but you cannot remain in Cedar Falls, bringing continued shame upon our family." Eleanor spent her final week in her childhood home, making preparations for a future she could barely imagine. With winter approaching and her pregnancy in its final stage, her options were severely limited. She had small savings of her own, plus the modest sum her parents were providing, but not enough to establish herself comfortably in any of the larger cities where she might find work and anonymity. After careful consideration, Eleanor decided to travel to Millbrook, a mill town about 50 miles from Cedar Falls, where she hoped to find lodging and work that would support her and her child. Millbrook was large enough to offer employment opportunities and small enough that the cost of living might be manageable on limited resources. Most importantly, it was far enough from Cedar Falls that her story might not precede her, allowing her to create a new identity as a widow rather than an unmarried mother. Eleanor's departure from Cedar Falls was witnessed by very few people. Her parents, despite their harsh ultimatum, wept as they said goodbye to their only child. Margaret packed a trunk with Eleanor's clothes and a few precious items, including several books from Thomas's shop and the family Bible. Thomas pressed a small purse of coins into Eleanor's hand, along with a letter of reference that carefully avoided mentioning the circumstances of her departure. "If you ever change your mind," Thomas said, as the hired wagon waited to take Eleanor to the train station, "if you ever decide to tell us the truth, you'll always be welcome home." Eleanor embraced her parents one final time, memorizing the feel of their arms around her and the familiar scent of her mother's rose-water perfume. "I love you both," she whispered, "and I'm sorry for the pain I've caused, but I cannot change my decision." As the wagon pulled away from the White House on Elm Street, where Eleanor had spent her entire life, she did not look back. The future ahead was uncertain and frightening, but she faced it with the dignity and determination that had sustained her through months of scandal and social ostracism. In her heart, she carried the secret of her love for James Mitchell and the hope that someday, when circumstances allowed, they would be reunited and their sacrifice would be vindicated. Eleanor Whitmore left Cedar Falls as a fallen woman, cast out by her family and community for refusing to name her child's father. She had no way of knowing that 18 years later, the man whose reputation she had protected at such personal cost would return as one of the most powerful railroad magnates in America, or that her steadfast loyalty would ultimately be rewarded in ways that would astonish everyone who had judged her so harshly. The train journey to Millbrook felt like traveling into another world entirely. Eleanor pressed her face to the window as the familiar landscapes of her childhood disappeared behind her, replaced by industrial smokestacks and unfamiliar rolling hills dotted with mining operations and textile mills. Her swollen belly made sitting uncomfortable, and she shifted frequently in the hard wooden seat, trying to find a position that didn't cause the sharp pains that had been increasing in frequency over the past few days. The other passengers on the train gave her a wide berth once they noticed her condition and the absence of a wedding ring. A woman traveling alone in her state was clearly not respectable company, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the solitude their disapproval provided. She needed time to think, to plan, to prepare herself mentally for the challenges that lay ahead in a town where she knew no one and had no connections to ease her transition. Millbrook revealed itself gradually as the train wound through a valley carved by the Susquehanna River. Textile mills lined the riverbank, their tall brick chimneys sending columns of smoke into the grey November sky. Worker housing stretched up the hillsides in neat rows, while the larger homes of mill owners and managers occupied the higher ground overlooking the industrial center. It was neither beautiful nor welcoming, but it represented opportunity and anonymity, two things Eleanor desperately needed. The train station was bustling with activity when Eleanor disembarked, her single trunk containing everything she owned in the world. Mill workers were returning from their shifts, their faces tired and their clothes marked with the lint and dye stains that came from textile work. Eleanor watched them carefully, studying their interactions and trying to understand the social dynamics of this new environment she hoped to join. Finding lodging proved more challenging than Eleanor had anticipated. The first 3 boarding houses she approached took one look at her obvious pregnancy and politely but firmly declined to rent her a room. The proprietors were unwilling to house an unmarried pregnant woman, regardless of her ability to pay, citing concerns about their establishment's reputation and the comfort of their other tenants. By evening, Eleanor was exhausted and fighting back tears of frustration when she finally found refuge at Mrs. Catherine O'Brien's boarding house on the outskirts of the Mill District. Mrs. O'Brien was a widow in her 50s who had lost her husband in a mill accident 3 years earlier, and supported herself by renting rooms to workers and their families. Unlike the other landlords Eleanor had encountered, Mrs. O'Brien seemed more interested in Eleanor's ability to pay rent than in judging her circumstances. "I'll not be asking questions that aren't my business," Mrs. O'Brien said as she showed Eleanor to a small but clean room on the second floor. "You pay your rent on time, keep your space tidy and cause no trouble for the other tenants, and we'll get along fine. There's a doctor 2 streets over who tends to mill families when babies decide to arrive." The room was modest but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a small wardrobe, and a window that looked out over the mill district toward the river. Eleanor unpacked her few belongings with careful precision, arranging her books on the windowsill and hanging her dresses in the wardrobe. For the first time since leaving Cedar Falls, she allowed herself to feel a tentative sense of relief. She had found shelter, and now she needed to find work that would support her and her child. The next morning brought Eleanor's first real understanding of how difficult her situation would be. She visited several shops and businesses in Millbrook's small commercial district, seeking employment that might accommodate her condition and later allow her to care for an infant. The responses were universally discouraging. Shopkeepers took one look at her pregnancy and politely declined to consider her for employment, citing concerns about her ability to work effectively and the propriety of having an unmarried mother serving customers. "Perhaps after the baby comes and you've made proper arrangements," one merchant suggested, "you might try again. But we really couldn't consider employing someone in your current state." Eleanor began to understand that her pregnancy was not just a personal challenge, but a significant barrier to employment in a society that judged unmarried mothers harshly. The moral standards that had driven her from Cedar Falls were equally rigid in Millbrook, and her condition marked her as someone whose character was questionable regardless of the actual circumstances of her situation. It was Mrs. O'Brien who provided Eleanor's first real opportunity. The older woman had been observing Eleanor's daily departures and returns, noting the increasing discouragement in her young tenant's demeanor. One evening, she knocked on Eleanor's door with a proposal that would prove crucial to Eleanor's survival. "In Millbrook, I've been thinking about your situation," Mrs. O'Brien said without preamble, settling herself in the room's single chair while Eleanor sat on the bed. "I run this boarding house mostly by myself, and it's getting harder to manage all the cleaning, cooking, and washing for 8 tenants. If you're willing to help with the domestic work, I could reduce your rent significantly and provide meals as part of the arrangement." The offer was a lifeline Eleanor grasped immediately. "I would be very grateful for such an arrangement," she said, trying to keep the relief out of her voice. "I'm quite skilled at cooking and housekeeping, and I learn quickly." "Good," Mrs. O'Brien nodded approvingly. "We'll start tomorrow. The work isn't easy, but it's honest, and it'll give you time to prepare for when the baby comes. After that, we'll see what other arrangements might be possible." Working for Mrs. O'Brien provided Eleanor with more than just financial survival. It gave her purpose during the difficult final months of her pregnancy and allowed her to earn her keep while learning about the rhythms and challenges of life in an industrial town. The boarding house served mill workers, shop clerks, and craftsmen, people who worked hard for modest wages and appreciated honest domestic service. Eleanor threw herself into the work with determination born of necessity. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for tenants leaving for early mill shifts, spent her days cleaning rooms and washing linens, and prepared hearty evening meals for workers returning tired and hungry from their labor. The physical demands of the work were challenging given her advancing pregnancy, but Eleanor found satisfaction in the routine and purpose it provided. The other tenants gradually accepted Eleanor's presence, though with varying degrees of warmth. Some remained aloof, clearly uncomfortable with her unmarried status, while others showed kindness that helped ease her isolation. Mary Sullivan, a young woman who worked in the textile mill's sorting room, became particularly friendly, often staying after dinner to chat with Eleanor about life in Millbrook and the challenges facing working women. "Don't let the moral busy bodies get you down," Mary advised one evening as they washed dishes together in the boarding house kitchen. "Half the people pointing fingers have their own secrets they'd rather not discuss. You work hard, you're honest, and you're not hurting anyone. That's more than can be said for some of the so-called respectable folks in this town." Through Mary, Eleanor began to understand the complex social dynamics of Milltown life. There were strict hierarchies based on occupation, length of residence, and perceived respectability. But there was also a pragmatic acceptance of people who contributed to the community's functioning. Her position at Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house, while humble, was recognized as honest work that served a necessary function. As winter deepened and Eleanor's pregnancy approached its end, she found herself thinking constantly about James and wondering how he was faring in his railroad work. She had maintained their correspondence throughout her ordeal, though she had been careful to give no hint of her situation or her forced departure from Cedar Falls. Her letters continued to arrive at the Whitmore home, where her parents forwarded them to her new address without comment, maintaining this small connection to her former life. James's letters revealed his continued professional success, but also his growing frustration with the delays that kept preventing his return to Cedar Falls. A major financial crisis affecting several railroad companies had created uncertainty about future projects and forced postponement of his planned return. His letters expressed deep longing for their reunion and increasing concern about the extended separation. But Eleanor could not bring herself to add to his burdens by revealing her true circumstances. "I dream of the day when I can hold you again," James wrote in a letter that arrived during a December snowstorm. "Every success I achieve feels hollow without you to share it. I promise you, my darling Eleanor, that I will find a way to return soon. Nothing matters more to me than our future together." Eleanor pressed the letter to her heart, feeling tears she had been holding back for months finally spill over. The love in James's words was as strong as ever, but the gulf between his perception of her situation and her reality seemed insurmountable. How could she explain that she was no longer the respectable bookshop owner's daughter he had left in Cedar Falls, but a fallen woman cast out by her family and struggling to survive in a mill town? Eleanor's labor began on a bitter cold January morning while she was preparing breakfast for the boarding house tenants. The sharp pain that seized her midsection was unlike anything she had experienced, and she gripped the kitchen table until her knuckles turned white, fighting to maintain her composure until the tenants had left for their work. Mrs. O'Brien took charge of the situation with the calm efficiency of a woman who had birthed 5 children of her own and assisted at numerous neighborhood deliveries. She sent Mary Sullivan to fetch Dr. Samuel Morrison, the physician who served the mill district, and helped Eleanor to her room where she could labor in privacy. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through most of the day and into the evening. Eleanor had expected pain, but the intensity of labor was beyond anything she had imagined. Dr. Morrison, a practical man who treated mill families without moral judgment, provided competent care, while Mrs. O'Brien offered encouragement and support that Eleanor's own mother might have given under different circumstances. "You're doing fine, lass," Mrs. O'Brien murmured during the most difficult moments. "First babies take their time, but this one will be worth the wait. I can tell." When Eleanor's son finally arrived as snow swirled against the bedroom window, she felt a love so immediate and overwhelming that it took her breath away. The tiny, red-faced infant who was placed in her arms was perfect in every detail, from his shock of dark hair to his firmly clenched fists. Looking down at his face, Eleanor saw unmistakable traces of James in the shape of his eyes and the set of his features. "He's beautiful," Dr. Morrison observed as he completed his examination. "Healthy and strong. What will you name him?" Eleanor had thought about names throughout her pregnancy, but seeing her son's face made the decision clear. "Thomas," she said, honoring her father despite their estrangement. "Thomas James Mitchell." She added James's surname without hesitation, claiming for her son the heritage that was rightfully his, regardless of the circumstances of his birth. The weeks following Thomas's birth were among the most challenging of Eleanor's life. She had expected the physical exhaustion of caring for a newborn, but she had underestimated the emotional toll of doing so without family support or a husband's assistance. Mrs. O'Brien proved invaluable during this period, helping with the baby when Eleanor needed to rest, and gradually allowing her to resume lighter duties around the boarding house as she recovered her strength. The tenants' reactions to the baby were mixed, but generally more positive than Eleanor had feared. Most were practical people who understood that children were a part of life, regardless of the circumstances of their arrival. Several of the women, tenants, offered advice about infant care, and even some of the men showed unexpected kindness, bringing small gifts or offering to help with heavy work when they saw Eleanor struggling. Thomas proved to be a remarkably good baby, sleeping for reasonable periods and nursing well, despite Eleanor's initial inexperience. She found herself marveling at the intensity of her love for this tiny person who depended entirely on her care and protection. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every moment of uncertainty was balanced by the joy of watching him grow and develop his own unique personality. As spring arrived and Thomas grew stronger, Eleanor began to consider her long-term options more seriously. Mrs. O'Brien's arrangement had provided crucial support during the most difficult period, but Eleanor needed to establish greater independence and security for herself and her son. The boarding house work, while honest, offered limited prospects for advancement or increased earnings. Eleanor's solution came through an unexpected source. Dr. Morrison, who had attended Thomas's birth and continued to check on both mother and child, mentioned during one of his visits that he was seeking someone to assist in his medical practice. His previous assistant had married and moved away, leaving him short-handed with the demanding needs of his Mill District patients. The work would involve basic nursing care, maintaining medical supplies, and helping with administrative tasks. Dr. Morrison explained, "It's not easy work, and it requires discretion and reliability, but it pays better than most employment available to women. Your education and evident intelligence make you a potentially good candidate." The position offered Eleanor several advantages beyond improved income. Medical work carried more social respectability than domestic service, potentially easing some of the stigma she faced as an unmarried mother. Dr. Morrison's practice served working families who were less likely to judge her harshly than the middle-class families she might encounter in other employment. Most importantly, the doctor was willing to arrange the work schedule around her need to care for Thomas. Eleanor accepted the position eagerly and proved herself capable and dedicated from her first day. Her education allowed her to assist with record-keeping and correspondence that many patients found difficult to manage themselves. Her natural empathy and careful attention to detail made her effective at basic nursing care. Most significantly, her own experience with hardship and social judgment made her particularly compassionate toward patients who faced their own challenges and difficulties. Working with Dr. Morrison exposed Eleanor to the full spectrum of Milltown life. She assisted with births, injuries, and illnesses that affected families struggling to make ends meet on mill wages. She saw the toll that dangerous working conditions took on men's bodies and the stress that financial insecurity placed on marriages and families. The experience broadened her understanding of social issues and deepened her appreciation for the resilience of working people. Dr. Morrison proved to be an excellent employer, treating Eleanor with professional respect despite her irregular situation. He was a practical man who judged people by their competence and character rather than their adherence to social conventions. Under his guidance, Eleanor developed medical knowledge and skills that would prove valuable throughout her life. "You have natural instincts for this work," Dr. Morrison observed, after Eleanor had been with him for several months. "Your patients trust you, and you're developing good clinical judgment. With proper training, you could become a skilled nurse, or even consider more advanced medical education." The suggestion of further education planted seeds in Eleanor's mind that would continue to grow over the following years. For now, she focused on mastering her current responsibilities while caring for Thomas, who was developing into a bright, curious toddler, with his father's intelligent eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Eleanor's letters to James continued. Throughout this period, though they required increasing creativity to maintain the fiction, that she remained in Cedar Falls, helping her father with the bookshop. She wrote about local events she learned from neighbors who still corresponded with Cedar Falls residents, carefully avoiding any details that might reveal her true circumstances. James's responses indicated his continued professional success, but also his growing frustration with circumstances that prevented his return. "The political situation surrounding railroad expansion has become incredibly complex," James wrote in one letter. "Financial interests, government regulations, and competing companies have created delays that extend far beyond my control. I'm being considered for a major promotion that could secure our future, but it would require at least another year of dedicated work before I could return to Pennsylvania." Eleanor understood the professional considerations that kept James away, but the extended separation was taking an emotional toll that she struggled to hide in her responses. Watching Thomas grow and develop without his father's presence, she sometimes felt overwhelmed by the weight of secrets she carried and the challenges of single parenthood. The closest Eleanor came to revealing her situation occurred during Thomas's second winter, when he developed a serious fever that Dr. Morrison initially feared might be pneumonia. For 3 days, Eleanor maintained a bedside vigil, applying cooling cloths and administering medicines while fighting her own fever of worry and exhaustion. During the worst night, when Thomas's breathing became labored and his temperature soared dangerously high, Eleanor found herself composing a mental letter to James that would explain everything, imagining how she would tell him about their son, if the worst happened. The thought of Thomas dying without his father ever knowing of his existence seemed unbearable. "Please don't take him," Eleanor whispered to whatever divine forces might be listening. "Let me raise him to know his father. Let me keep the promises I made." Thomas's fever broke at dawn, and he began the slow process of recovery that would restore him to full health. But the crisis had shown Eleanor how fragile her situation remained and how much she depended on her son's continued well-being for her own emotional survival. As Thomas approached his 3rd birthday, Eleanor began to allow herself cautious optimism about their future. Her position with Dr. Morrison was secure and provided adequate income for their modest needs. Thomas was healthy, intelligent, and beginning to show signs of the same curiosity about the world that had characterized both his parents. They had found a place in Millbrook's community, not as full equals perhaps, but as accepted members who contributed to the town's functioning. Eleanor had even begun to develop tentative friendships with other women who appreciated her intelligence and work ethic more than they judged her unmarried status. Mary Sullivan remained her closest friend, but she had also found companionship with several patients' wives who valued her medical knowledge and willingness to help during family crises. The transformation from the frightened, pregnant young woman who had arrived in Millbrook to the competent, independent working mother she had become represented a journey Eleanor could never have imagined when she first made the decision to protect James's career by bearing their child alone. She had discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed and developed skills that gave her confidence about facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Yet despite her growing independence and security, Eleanor's heart remained firmly committed to the man whose letters continued to arrive regularly, expressing unwavering love and determination to return when circumstances allowed. She had built a life that could sustain her and Thomas, but it remained incomplete without the partner who had originally inspired her sacrifice. James's most recent letters hinted that significant changes in his professional situation might finally allow his return to Pennsylvania within the year. Eleanor read these hints with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, knowing that his return would force her to confront the consequences of years of concealment and decide whether the love they had shared could survive the revelation of what had transpired during their separation. The woman who would face that reunion bore little resemblance to the sheltered bookshop owner's daughter who had fallen in love with a railroad surveyor in Cedar Falls. Eleanor had been tested by poverty, social ostracism, and the challenges of single motherhood. She had developed professional skills, emotional resilience, and a deep understanding of life's complexities that her younger self could never have imagined. Whether these changes would strengthen or complicate her relationship with James remained to be seen, but Eleanor faced the future with the confidence of someone who had survived whatever life could impose and emerged stronger for the experience. The decisions she had made years earlier continued to shape her reality, but she no longer questioned whether they had been right. Time would reveal whether her sacrifice had been worthwhile, but she had no regrets about the path she had chosen, or the woman it had helped her become. The letter that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by the same postal clerk who had brought Eleanor's correspondence from James for nearly 4 years. But this envelope was different, bearing the official seal of the Pennsylvania and Western Railroad Company, rather than James's familiar handwriting. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it, fearing news that would shatter the careful life she had constructed around the hope of his eventual return. The contents were both devastating and confusing. The railroad company regretted to inform her that James Mitchell had been killed in a construction accident in Colorado 3 months earlier. His personal effects were being held for the next of kin, and the company had found her name and address among his papers as someone to be notified in case of emergency. The letter was signed by a company official who expressed sympathy for her loss while maintaining the impersonal tone of corporate correspondence. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated her consciousness. James was dead. The man she had loved, waited for, and protected through years of sacrifice and hardship would never return to claim her as his bride or acknowledge their son. The future she had sustained herself with through the darkest moments of social ostracism and poverty had been swept away in a single paragraph of corporate condolences. The grief that overwhelmed Eleanor was unlike anything she had experienced, even during the worst periods of her exile from Cedar Falls. When her father had died, she had mourned the loss of a beloved parent, while understanding that death was a natural conclusion to a life well lived. James's death felt like a cosmic injustice, the cruel termination of a love story that should have had decades more to unfold. Dr. Morrison found Eleanor sobbing over the letter when he arrived at the office that morning, Thomas playing quietly nearby, unaware that he had just lost the father he had never known. The kind physician took charge of the situation with the same practical compassion he showed his patients, sending word that the office would be closed for the day and helping Eleanor to process the immediate implications of her devastating news. "I'm so sorry, my dear," Dr. Morrison said gently, having learned over the years to read between the lines of Eleanor's carefully maintained silence about Thomas's father. "I gather this was someone very important to you." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak through her tears. The weight of 4 years of secrecy suddenly felt unbearable, and she found herself telling Dr. Morrison the entire story. The love affair with James, the pregnancy that had forced her exile from Cedar Falls, the years of waiting and hoping for a reunion that would never come. Dr. Morrison listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped Eleanor organize her thoughts and emotions. When she finished her account, he was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what she had revealed. "You've carried an enormous burden alone," he said finally. "The strength it must have taken to protect his reputation while raising his child in such difficult circumstances is remarkable. But now you must decide what comes next." The question of what came next would torment Eleanor for weeks. James's death had eliminated not only her hoped-for future, but also the primary reason for the secrecy she had maintained about Thomas's parentage. Should she contact the railroad company to claim James's effects and establish Thomas's right to whatever inheritance might exist? Should she write to her parents in Cedar Falls and reveal the truth about her situation? Should she simply continue the life she had built in Millbrook, allowing the past to remain buried with the man who had been its central figure? Eleanor's first impulse was to retreat into the safety of continued secrecy. She had built a stable life for herself and Thomas that didn't depend on anyone else's recognition or approval. Thomas was thriving in Millbrook, developing friendships with other children and showing exceptional intelligence in his informal education. Eleanor's position with Dr. Morrison provided financial security and social respectability that she was reluctant to jeopardize by revealing the complicated truth about her past. But as the initial shock of grief began to subside, Eleanor found herself reconsidering her options with greater clarity. James was beyond hurt now, and the career she had protected no longer existed to be damaged by revelation of their relationship. Thomas deserved to know the truth about his father's identity and character, to understand that he was the product of genuine love rather than moral failure. And Eleanor herself was tired of living with secrets that had shaped every aspect of her life for 4 years. The decision to contact the railroad company required considerable courage. Eleanor spent days composing and recomposing her letter, trying to strike the right balance between establishing her legitimate connection to James and maintaining her dignity despite the irregular circumstances. Finally, she settled on a straightforward approach that emphasized their engagement and her right to information about his death and effects. The railroad company's response was surprisingly prompt and respectful. A company representative wrote that they would be pleased to forward James's personal belongings to her and that she was welcome to visit their Pittsburgh office to discuss any questions about his employment and death. The letter also mentioned that James had accumulated a small savings account and had made investments in company stock that would be transferred to his designated beneficiary. Eleanor's journey to Pittsburgh was her first extended travel since arriving in Millbrook, and the trip felt like stepping into a larger world that she had almost forgotten existed. Thomas remained with Mrs. O'Brien, who had become something of a grandmother figure to the boy and was delighted to care for him during Eleanor's absence. The railroad company offices occupied an impressive brick building in Pittsburgh's business district, and Eleanor felt intimidated by the formal atmosphere as she was shown to the office of Mr. Charles Henderson, the official handling James's affairs. Henderson was a middle-aged man with a carefully groomed beard and the polished manner of someone accustomed to dealing with bereaved families. "Miss Whitmore," Henderson said, rising from his desk as Eleanor was announced. "Please accept my condolences on Mr. Mitchell's passing. He was highly regarded by everyone who worked with him." Eleanor appreciated the respectful tone, though she noticed Henderson's careful avoidance of assuming her marital status. "Thank you," she replied. "Could you tell me something about how he died?" "The letter I received contained very few details." Henderson consulted a file on his desk before responding. Mr. Mitchell was overseeing construction of a particularly challenging bridge section in the Rocky Mountains when an early winter storm caused an avalanche. He and 2 other men were caught in the slide while attempting to secure equipment. Their bodies were recovered several weeks later when the weather improved. The clinical description of James's death was somehow more painful than Eleanor had expected. She had imagined him dying instantly in some dramatic accident, not gradually freezing in a mountain avalanche while trying to fulfill his professional responsibilities. The image of him struggling against the elements, perhaps thinking of her, in his final moments, was almost unbearable. Was he— Eleanor paused, struggling to formulate her question diplomatically. Did he ever mention plans to return to Pennsylvania? I know he had spoken of settling down eventually. Henderson's expression softened slightly. Actually, yes. Mr. Mitchell had recently been promoted to a senior engineering position that would have allowed him to choose his own assignments. His supervisor mentioned that he had specifically requested to return to Pennsylvania and had spoken frequently of someone he intended to marry. I assume that was you. Eleanor nodded, feeling tears threatening again at this confirmation that James had been actively planning their reunion when death intervened. We were engaged before he left for his railroad work. Circumstances prevented us from marrying immediately, but we had maintained our commitment to each other. I'm very sorry, Henderson said with genuine sympathy. Such a tragedy when young people's plans are cut short by circumstances beyond their control. He opened a wooden box on his desk and withdrew several items. These were his personal effects. The company thought you should have them. Eleanor accepted the box with trembling hands, recognizing immediately the surveying instruments she had seen James use during their courtship in Cedar Falls. There were also letters, including several of her own that he had kept, a small photograph of her that she had given him before his departure, and a leather journal filled with his handwriting. Most significantly, there was a ring, clearly intended as an engagement ring, wrapped carefully in cloth along with a letter addressed to her. In James's handwriting, the letter was dated only 2 weeks before his death. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "as I write this, I am finally in a position to fulfill the promises I made to you before leaving Cedar Falls. My promotion has been confirmed, and I will be returning to Pennsylvania before Christmas to claim you as my bride. I cannot wait to see your face again and to begin the life we have planned together for so long." The letter continued with details about his plans for their future, including his intention to start his own engineering firm and his dreams of building a family with her. Reading his words of love and anticipation, written when he had no idea that she had already borne his child and been living as an exile for years, Eleanor felt the full weight of their tragedy. Henderson also provided information about James's financial situation that surprised Eleanor. His careful management of his railroad earnings, combined with wise investments in company stock and land speculation, had accumulated into a substantial sum. As his intended beneficiary, Eleanor would inherit not only his savings, but also several valuable properties he had purchased in anticipation of their marriage. Mr. Mitchell was quite successful in his investments, Henderson explained. He often spoke of wanting to provide security for his family. These holdings should ensure a comfortable future for you. Eleanor left Pittsburgh with mixed emotions. The confirmation of James's love and his plans for their reunion provided some comfort, but it also intensified her grief for the life they would never share. The financial inheritance, while welcome, felt like poor compensation for the loss of the man she had loved and waited for through years of hardship. Returning to Millbrook, Eleanor faced decisions that would determine the course of her and Thomas's future. The inheritance from James made it possible for her to consider options that had previously been beyond her reach. She could relocate to a larger city where her past would be unknown, perhaps even return to the East, where she might claim the status of a young widow rather than an unmarried mother. She could invest the money in business ventures that would provide independence and security for years to come. But Eleanor found herself reluctant to abandon the life she had built in Millbrook. Dr. Morrison had become not just an employer, but a mentor and friend who had supported her through her most difficult periods. Thomas had roots in the community and friendships that would be disrupted by relocation. Most importantly, Eleanor had discovered her own strength and capabilities in Millbrook, developing confidence and skills that she was hesitant to abandon for the uncertainty of starting over elsewhere. Eleanor's solution combined practical wisdom with emotional healing. She used part of James's inheritance to purchase the building that housed Dr. Morrison's medical practice, securing both her position and his practice for the future. She also invested in several rental properties in Millbrook that would provide steady income while contributing to the community's development. Most significantly, Eleanor decided to establish a small school in Millbrook, focusing on providing education for the children of millworkers who often lacked access to quality learning opportunities. Her own love of books and learning, combined with her understanding of working families' needs, made her uniquely qualified to create an educational program that would serve the community while providing a meaningful outlet for her own talents and energy. The school project allowed Eleanor to channel her grief into constructive action while creating a legacy that would honor James's memory and provide opportunities for children like Thomas. She hired qualified teachers, designed a curriculum that combined academic subjects with practical skills, and established scholarship programs for families who couldn't afford tuition. Thomas, now old enough to understand basic concepts of family and relationships, began asking more direct questions about his father. Eleanor decided that he deserved to know the truth about James, presented in age-appropriate terms that emphasized the love that had created him rather than the circumstances that had prevented his parents' marriage. "Your father was a very good man," Eleanor told Thomas one evening as they looked through James's journal together. "He loved me very much, and he would have loved you too if he had lived to meet you. He died doing important work that helped connect communities and make life better for many people." Thomas studied the photograph of James that Eleanor had received from the railroad company, tracing the features he could recognize in his own reflection. "Do I look like him?" he asked, with the curiosity of a child discovering his place in the world. "You have his eyes and his intelligence," Eleanor replied, smoothing Thomas's dark hair, "and I think you'll have his determination to make the world a better place too." As Thomas grew older, Eleanor shared more details about James's character and accomplishments, always emphasizing the positive qualities he had inherited from his father, while avoiding the pain and scandal that had surrounded his conception and birth. Thomas developed a sense of pride in his father's memory that helped compensate for the absence of a male parent in his daily life. Eleanor's school thrived, attracting students from throughout the Mill District and earning respect from community leaders who recognized its value. Her success as an educator and businesswoman gradually elevated her social status in Millbrook, transforming her from a woman of questionable reputation into a respected community leader whose opinions were sought on various local issues. The aid transformation was neither quick nor complete. Some residents continued to view Eleanor with suspicion, and certain social circles remained closed to her regardless of her accomplishments. But Eleanor had learned to value her own worth independently of others' approval, and she focused her energy on relationships and activities that brought fulfillment rather than social acceptance. Dr. Morrison remained one of Eleanor's closest friends and advisors, serving as an unofficial mentor as she navigated the challenges of business ownership and community leadership. Their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving their community's needs. "You've accomplished something remarkable," Dr. Morrison observed one evening as they reviewed the school's enrollment records. "You've taken tragedy and hardship and transformed them into opportunities that benefit dozens of families. James Mitchell would be very proud of what you've built in his memory." Eleanor appreciated the recognition, but she knew that her accomplishments had been motivated by more than memorial. The challenges she had faced as an unmarried mother had given her unique insight into the struggles facing other women and families in similar circumstances. Her success had been built on understanding needs that others might overlook and creating solutions that addressed real problems rather than imagined ones. As Thomas approached school age himself, Eleanor faced new decisions about his education and future. The boy was exceptionally bright, showing aptitude for mathematics and engineering that reminded Eleanor of his father's intellectual gifts. She wanted to provide him with educational opportunities that would allow him to develop his potential fully, but she also needed to consider how his irregular birth circumstances might affect his acceptance in more formal educational settings. Eleanor's solution was characteristically practical and forward-thinking. She arranged for Thomas to receive primary education at her own school, where his abilities could be nurtured without prejudice, while also providing him with supplementary instruction in advanced subjects through correspondence courses and private tutoring. This approach allowed him to develop his talents while remaining close to the supportive community environment that had shaped his early years. Thomas flourished under this educational arrangement, displaying the same curiosity about the world that had characterized both his parents. By age 8, he was reading advanced mathematics texts and conducting simple engineering experiments that impressed even Dr. Morrison, who had developed a grandfatherly affection for the boy. "That child has the makings of a brilliant engineer," Dr. Morrison observed after watching Thomas design and build a complex system of pulleys and levers. "He's inherited the best of both his parents' intellectual gifts." Eleanor took pride in Thomas's development while remaining mindful of the challenges he would face as he grew older. His illegitimate birth would continue to create obstacles in a society that judged children by their parents' marital status. But Eleanor was determined to prepare him with the skills and confidence necessary to overcome such prejudices through his own merit and character. The years following James's death had transformed Eleanor from a young woman dependent on others' approval into a self-reliant individual who created her own opportunities and defined her own worth. The tragedy that had initially seemed to destroy her carefully planned future had instead revealed strengths and capabilities she might never have discovered under more conventional circumstances. Eleanor's love for James remained a constant presence in her life, but it had evolved from the romantic passion of youth into a deeper appreciation for the values and dreams they had shared. She honored his memory not through dwelling on what might have been, but by embodying the qualities he had admired. The autumn of 1903 brought unexpected visitors to Millbrook that would forever alter the carefully constructed world Eleanor had built for herself and Thomas. What started as routine business correspondence about railroad expansion through their valley soon revealed connections to Eleanor's past that she had never imagined possible. The name on the letterhead of the Grand Western Railroad Company was one she recognized immediately, though she had not seen it in nearly 2 decades. William Harrison had been James Mitchell's closest friend during their engineering training, an ambitious young man who had chosen a different path in the railroad industry than James had pursued. While James had focused on hands-on construction and surveying work, William had gravitated toward the financial and administrative aspects of railroad development. Eleanor remembered him as intelligent but somewhat cold, more interested in profit margins than in the human communities that railroads were meant to serve. The letter that arrived at Eleanor's school was formal and businesslike, requesting a meeting to discuss the Grand Western Railroad's plans for a new line that would pass directly through Millbrook. The company was interested in purchasing several properties for right-of-way access, including some of the rental buildings that Eleanor had acquired with James's inheritance. What caught Eleanor's attention, however, was not the business proposal, but the personal note written in William's hand at the bottom of the official correspondence. Mrs. Whitmore, the note began, using the title Eleanor had gradually adopted in Millbrook to simplify social interactions. I believe we may have mutual acquaintances from years past. I would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss not only business matters, but also some personal questions that have arisen during my research into this area's history. I hope you will grant me an interview at your earliest convenience. Eleanor studied the note carefully, trying to interpret its meaning. William's reference to mutual acquaintances could only mean James, but she couldn't imagine what personal questions might have arisen after all these years. James had been dead for over a decade, and any connections between his past and her current life should have been buried with him. Thomas, now 18 and preparing for advanced engineering studies through correspondence with several universities, noticed his mother's unusual preoccupation with the business letter. At 18, he had grown into a young man who strongly resembled his father, with the same thoughtful eyes and determined chin that Eleanor remembered from her courtship days. His intelligence had developed along the lines Eleanor had hoped, combining practical engineering skills with a broader understanding of social and economic issues. "Is something troubling you about this railroad proposal?" Thomas asked, observing Eleanor's repeated reading of the correspondence. The financial terms seem fair, and railroad access would benefit the entire community. Eleanor hesitated before responding, uncertain how much to reveal about her concerns. Thomas knew the basic facts about his father's death and had developed a healthy pride in James's professional accomplishments, but Eleanor had never shared details about the broader network of relationships that had surrounded James's career. The possibility that William Harrison might know or suspect more about her connection to James created complications she was not prepared to explain. "The company president is someone who knew your father during their engineering training," Eleanor said carefully. "I'm simply wondering what personal questions he might want to discuss after all these years." Thomas's interest was immediately engaged. Any information about his father was precious to him, given the limited details Eleanor had been able to provide over the years. "Perhaps he has stories about father that might interest us," Thomas suggested hopefully, "or maybe documents or photographs that weren't returned with his personal effects." Eleanor agreed to meet with William Harrison, though with considerable apprehension about what the encounter might reveal. She arranged for the meeting to take place at her school rather than her home, wanting to maintain some professional distance while also demonstrating the substantial community position she had achieved since leaving Cedar Falls. William arrived in Millbrook on a crisp October morning, traveling in a private railroad car that impressed the townspeople and reminded everyone of the wealth and influence he had accumulated during his career. Eleanor watched from her office window as he disembarked, noting that the years had treated him well. He was impeccably dressed in expensive clothing that proclaimed his success, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his wishes accommodated. Their meeting began with polite discussion of the railroad company's expansion plans and the specific properties William's company wanted to acquire. Eleanor listened carefully to the proposals, asking informed questions that demonstrated her business acumen and knowledge of property values. William seemed impressed by her competence, making several respectful comments about the quality of her investments and the success of her educational enterprise. "You've built something quite remarkable here," William observed, gesturing toward the classroom where Eleanor's students were engaged in morning lessons. "James always said you had exceptional intelligence, but I don't think even he imagined you'd become such a successful businesswoman and educator." The casual reference to James sent a chill through Eleanor, confirming her suspicion that this meeting involved more than routine business negotiations. "You remember our acquaintance from Cedar Falls?" she asked carefully, trying to gauge how much William knew about their relationship. William's expression grew more serious, and he leaned forward in his chair with the intensity Eleanor remembered from his youth. "I remember more than our acquaintance, Eleanor. I remember James's letters from Colorado, filled with plans for returning to Pennsylvania to marry you. I remember his excitement about starting his own engineering firm and building a family with the woman he loved." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under William's direct questioning. "James and I were engaged," she admitted. "His death was a terrible tragedy that ended plans we had made for our future together." "Yes," William agreed, "but that's not the whole story, is it? I've spent considerable time researching the circumstances surrounding James's death, partly for business reasons and partly out of genuine concern for my old friend's memory. The investigation led me to some interesting discoveries about what happened after he left Cedar Falls." William reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew several documents that he placed on Eleanor's desk with deliberate precision. "These are employment records from the Pennsylvania and Western Railroad, showing the beneficiary designation James made for his life insurance and accumulated savings. Your name appears as his intended bride to receive all benefits in the event of his death." Eleanor nodded, seeing nothing unexpected in this information. "The railroad company contacted me after James died and arranged for the transfer of his savings and personal effects. I used the inheritance to establish myself in business and to create this school as a memorial to his values and dreams." "That's all quite admirable," William continued, "but it raises some interesting questions about timing and circumstances. According to railroad records, James died in March of 1889. According to my inquiries in Cedar Falls, you left that town under somewhat mysterious circumstances in late 1885, nearly 4 years earlier. The timing suggests that your departure had nothing to do with James's death." Eleanor felt trapped by William's methodical presentation of facts she had never expected anyone to piece together. "My family situation became complicated," she said evasively. "I needed to establish independence and found opportunities in Millbrook that wouldn't have been available in Cedar Falls." William studied her face intently, clearly unconvinced by her vague explanation. "Eleanor, I'm not here to cause you difficulty or embarrassment, but I am here because I believe there are facts about James's life and death that deserve to be properly understood and acknowledged. I think you left Cedar Falls because you were carrying James's child." The direct accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow, though she managed to maintain her outward composure. "That's a very serious allegation to make without proof," she said quietly. "I have proof," William replied, producing another document from his briefcase. Birth records from Millbrook showing the registration of Thomas James Mitchell, born to Eleanor Whitmore in January 1886. The timing corresponds exactly with when James would have conceived a child during his final weeks in Cedar Falls. Eleanor stared at the birth certificate, realizing that her carefully guarded secret had been exposed through public records she had never considered might be investigated years later. The document showed Thomas's full name, including the surname she had claimed for him based on his biological parentage. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked, feeling years of protective secrecy crumbling around her. "What do you hope to accomplish by investigating ancient history that affects no one but my family?" William's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of genuine emotion since their conversation had begun. "Because I believe Thomas deserves to know the full truth about his heritage, and because I think James would have wanted his son to have opportunities that only acknowledgement of his parentage can provide." The words sent shockwaves through Eleanor's understanding of the situation. "What do you mean by opportunities?" William leaned back in his chair, assuming the demeanor of a man about to reveal information of considerable importance. James Mitchell was not the only one who invested successfully during his railroad career. "I've been even more fortunate in my business ventures, building the Grand Western Railroad into one of the most profitable transportation companies in the country. But I've never married, never had children of my own." Eleanor began to grasp the implications of William's statement, though she hardly dared to believe what he seemed to be suggesting. "James was my closest friend," William continued, "and I've always regretted that his death prevented him from achieving the success and happiness he deserved. When I discovered that he had a son who apparently inherited his father's intelligence and engineering aptitude, I saw an opportunity to honor my friend's memory in a meaningful way." William rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the bustling activity of Millbrook's Mill District. "I'm prepared to offer Thomas a position with the Grand Western Railroad, starting immediately if he's interested. Not charity, but genuine employment based on his abilities and potential. With proper training and experience, he could eventually inherit significant responsibilities within the company." The offer was so unexpected and generous that Eleanor initially suspected some hidden motive or condition. "Why would you make such an offer to someone you've never met?" "Because he's James Mitchell's son," William replied simply. "Because talent and intelligence deserve opportunities regardless of the circumstances of birth, and because I believe James would have wanted his child to have chances that his irregular parentage might otherwise deny him." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the implications of William's proposal. Thomas had been planning to continue his engineering education through correspondence courses and perhaps eventually seek employment with a railroad company, but such positions were difficult to obtain without family connections or formal credentials. William's offer could provide Thomas with opportunities that might otherwise take years to achieve. But accepting William's help would also mean acknowledging publicly the truth about Thomas's parentage, potentially exposing Eleanor to renewed scandal and Thomas to social prejudices they had both avoided by maintaining their carefully constructed privacy in Millbrook. "I need time to consider this," Eleanor said finally, "and I need to discuss it with Thomas. He's old enough to make his own decisions about his future, but he deserves to understand all the implications before making such a choice." William nodded approvingly. "Of course. This is a decision that will affect his entire life, and it should be made thoughtfully." He gathered his documents and returned them to his briefcase. "But I hope you'll also consider what this opportunity could mean for Thomas's future. The railroad industry is growing rapidly, and someone with his background and abilities could achieve remarkable success." After William's departure, Eleanor found herself facing one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Thomas had grown up knowing that his father had been a talented engineer who died tragically young, but he had never been told the specific circumstances surrounding his birth or the reasons for Eleanor's departure from Cedar Falls. The time had come to reveal the full truth about their family history and allow Thomas to decide how that knowledge should shape his future. Eleanor chose to have this conversation at home, in the familiar surroundings where Thomas had grown up and developed his sense of identity. She prepared his favorite meal and waited until evening when they could talk without interruption from the daily demands of school and business responsibilities. "Thomas," Eleanor began carefully, "Mr. Harrison's visit today brought up some family history that I think you're old enough to understand fully. There are things about your father and our relationship that I haven't told you because the circumstances were complicated and potentially painful." Thomas listened attentively as Eleanor recounted the story of her love affair with James, the unplanned pregnancy that had forced her exile from Cedar Falls, and the years of waiting for a reunion that never came. She explained her decision to protect James's reputation and career by bearing their child alone, and the challenges she had faced as an unmarried mother in an unforgiving society. Throughout Eleanor's account, Thomas's expression remained thoughtful rather than shocked or judgmental. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes, processing the information and its implications for his understanding of his own identity. "So I was conceived out of wedlock," Thomas said finally, "but by parents who genuinely loved each other and would have married if circumstances had permitted." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Your father never knew about your existence, but he loved me deeply and had definite plans to return and make me his wife. You were created by love, even if that love couldn't be publicly acknowledged at the time." Thomas nodded slowly, showing the same thoughtful deliberation that had characterized his father's personality. "And now, Mr. Harrison is offering me opportunities based on father's friendship and my biological connection to the Mitchell name?" "That's correct," Eleanor replied. "But accepting his offer would mean acknowledging publicly the circumstances of your birth. There could be social consequences that might affect both of us." Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the town where he had grown up and developed his own sense of identity. "Mother," he said quietly, "you've sacrificed years of your life to protect me from scandal and social prejudice. You've built a respected position in this community and provided me with excellent education and opportunities. I think the time has come for me to take responsibility for my own future, rather than allowing you to continue bearing burdens that are rightfully mine." The maturity and wisdom in Thomas's response reminded Eleanor powerfully of his father, showing the same combination of practical thinking and moral courage that had attracted her to James years earlier. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew his decision. "I'm saying that I want to meet with Mr. Harrison and learn more about his offer," Thomas replied firmly. "I'm not ashamed of the circumstances of my birth, especially now that I understand they resulted from genuine love rather than careless behavior. If there are opportunities available to me because of my father's reputation and abilities, I think I should explore them rather than hiding from my heritage." Eleanor felt a complex mixture of pride and apprehension at Thomas's decision. She had raised him to be independent and confident, but the prospect of him entering a world where his irregular birth might create challenges was still frightening for a mother who had protected him from such difficulties for 18 years. "Are you certain you're ready for the complications that might arise?" Eleanor asked. "Society can be cruel to those who don't fit conventional expectations." Thomas turned from the window to face his mother directly, his expression showing determination that reminded Eleanor of herself during the most difficult periods of their journey. "Mother, You've taught me by example that a person's worth is determined by their character and actions, not by circumstances beyond their control. I believe in those values, and I'm willing to defend them if necessary." The conversation continued late into the evening as Eleanor and Thomas explored all aspects of William's offer and its potential consequences. By the time they retired for the night, they had reached a mutual decision to arrange another meeting with William Harrison, this time with Thomas present to hear the proposal directly and ask his own questions about the opportunities being offered. Eleanor's final thought before sleep was a prayer of gratitude for the remarkable young man Thomas had become despite the challenging circumstances of his childhood. Whatever the future held, she was confident that he possessed the intelligence, integrity, and strength of character necessary to navigate the complexities ahead and to honor the memory of the father he had never known, but whose legacy lived on in his son's promise and potential. The second meeting with William Harrison took place 3 days later, this time in the parlor of Eleanor's home, where Thomas could participate fully in the discussion. William arrived punctually, carrying additional documents and wearing an expression of eager anticipation that suggested he had been looking forward to meeting James's son. The introduction between William and Thomas was a moment Eleanor had been both anticipating and dreading. As the two men shook hands, she could see William studying Thomas's features, clearly recognizing the resemblance to his deceased friend. For his part, Thomas displayed the confident courtesy Eleanor had worked to develop in him, showing interest without subservience as he greeted the man who might shape his future. "You look remarkably like your father," William observed with obvious emotion, the same intelligent eyes and determined expression. "James would be very proud of the young man you've become." Thomas accepted the compliment gracefully while maintaining his composure. "I've always regretted not having the opportunity to know him personally, but Mother has shared many stories about his character and achievements that have inspired my own interests in engineering." William spent the next hour outlining his proposal in detail. The Grand Western Railroad was expanding rapidly throughout the Western Territories, requiring skilled engineers and administrators who could handle complex construction projects and community relations. Thomas would begin as a junior engineer, learning railroad operations through hands-on experience, while receiving advanced technical training from the company's most experienced professionals. The position would require extensive travel initially, William explained, as you gained experience on different types of projects in various locations. But the company is committed to developing capable leadership, and someone with your background and abilities could advance quickly to supervisory responsibilities. Thomas listened carefully to the proposal, asking informed questions that demonstrated his understanding of both technical and business aspects of railroad operations. Eleanor noted with pride that her son was holding his own in conversation with a man of William's experience and sophistication, showing none of the diffidence that might be expected from someone of his background. "What about my education?" Thomas inquired. "I've been planning to pursue formal engineering training through correspondence courses and eventually seek admission to a technical college." William's response revealed the comprehensive nature of his planning. The Grand Western Railroad maintains relationships with several excellent engineering schools that provide specialized training for our employees. You would have opportunities for formal education that would complement your practical experience, all paid for by the company, as an investment in your professional development. The offer was more generous than Eleanor had dared to hope, providing Thomas with opportunities that would have been nearly impossible to obtain through conventional channels. But she remained concerned about the social challenges he might face. As an acknowledged illegitimate son entering a business environment where family connections and social standing often determined advancement opportunities. "Mr. Harrison," Eleanor interjected carefully, "I appreciate the generosity of your offer, but I need to ask directly about potential difficulties Thomas might encounter because of the irregular circumstances of his birth. The business world can be unforgiving toward those who don't meet conventional social expectations." William's expression grew serious as he considered Eleanor's concern. "I won't pretend that Thomas's background won't create some challenges," he admitted. "There will be people who judge him based on circumstances rather than abilities. But the railroad industry values competence and results more than social pedigree, and I'm prepared to provide support and protection as Thomas establishes himself professionally." He leaned forward in his chair, addressing Thomas directly. "Your father was one of the most capable engineers I ever knew, respected by everyone who worked with him, despite his modest background. If you demonstrate similar abilities and integrity, you'll earn recognition based on your own merits. The circumstances of your birth will become irrelevant compared to your professional accomplishments." Thomas absorbed this assessment thoughtfully before responding. "I understand that I'll face additional scrutiny and possibly discrimination because of my irregular status, but I believe that overcoming such challenges would honor my father's memory and prove the values my mother has taught me about judging people by their character rather than their circumstances." The maturity and wisdom in Thomas's response clearly impressed William, who nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the attitude that will ensure your success." James had the same combination of practical realism and principled determination. Eleanor felt a surge of maternal pride at the comparison between Thomas and his father, but she also experienced renewed anxiety about releasing her son into a world that might prove harsher than he anticipated. "When would this position begin?" she asked, dreading the answer even as she recognized the importance of the opportunity. "As soon as Thomas is ready," William replied. "I have a construction project beginning in Nevada next month that would provide excellent initial experience. Thomas could accompany my senior engineers as an apprentice, learning railroad construction from the ground up while contributing to meaningful work." The timeline was faster than Eleanor had expected, allowing little time for gradual adjustment to the idea of Thomas leaving Millbrook for an uncertain future. But she recognized that delaying would not make the separation easier and might actually jeopardize the opportunities William was offering. Thomas seemed to sense his mother's emotional struggle with the practical realities of his decision. "Mother," he said gently, "I know this is difficult for you after all the years you've invested in raising and educating me, but I think the time has come for me to test myself in the wider world and to build upon the foundation you've provided." Eleanor nodded, knowing that Thomas was right, even as her maternal instincts rebelled against releasing him into potential dangers and challenges. "I'm proud of your courage and determination," she said quietly. "Your father would be proud, too." William concluded the meeting by providing Thomas with detailed information about the Nevada project and the practical arrangements for joining the engineering team. Thomas would travel by railroad to the construction site, where he would be provided with lodging and meals while learning his new responsibilities. His salary would be modest initially, but would increase rapidly as he demonstrated competence and took on greater responsibilities. As William prepared to depart, he made one final gesture that surprised both Eleanor and Thomas. From his briefcase, he withdrew a leather portfolio containing photographs and documents related to James Mitchell's railroad career, materials he had gathered during his investigation into his friend's life and death. "These belong to Thomas now," William said, presenting the portfolio with ceremonial gravity. James kept detailed records of his work and his dreams for the future. I think his son should have access to his father's thoughts and plans, particularly his ideas about railroad engineering and community development. Thomas accepted the portfolio with obvious emotion, holding it carefully as if it contained precious treasures. "Thank you," he said simply. "This means more to me than any professional opportunity." Eleanor watched the exchange with tears in her eyes, recognizing that William's gesture represented more than simple generosity. By providing Thomas with tangible connections to his father's work and dreams, William was acknowledging the legitimacy of Thomas's heritage and his right to claim James Mitchell's professional legacy. After William's departure, Eleanor and Thomas spent the evening examining the contents of the portfolio, discovering aspects of James's character and ambitions that even Eleanor had not fully understood during their courtship. James's engineering notebooks revealed not only technical competence, but also deep concern for the human communities affected by railroad development, a sensitivity that had influenced his approach to construction projects and community relations. He cared about more than just building railroads, Thomas observed, as he studied his father's detailed notes about community impact assessments and worker safety protocols. He understood that transportation systems should serve people rather than simply generating profits. Eleanor smiled at Thomas's insight, recognizing the values that had originally attracted her to James and that had been passed on to their son through character rather than direct instruction. "Your father believed that engineering should improve people's lives, not just solve technical problems. That's a perspective that would serve you well in your own career." As they prepared for bed that night, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in their lives during a single week. The revelation of Thomas's true parentage, the generous offer of professional opportunities, and the decision to embrace rather than hide from their complicated family history represented a fundamental shift in their relationship with the past and their expectations for the future. Thomas would be leaving Millbrook within the month to begin a career that might take him far from the community where he had grown up. But Eleanor realized that her son was ready for such challenges. The 18 years she had devoted to his education and character development had prepared him to honor his father's memory, while creating his own unique contribution to the world. The woman who had once hidden her pregnancy to protect a man's reputation had raised a son who was proud to claim that man's name and heritage, regardless of the social complications such acknowledgement might create. In doing so, Eleanor had achieved a victory that transcended the personal costs she had paid during years of exile and secrecy. 20 years had passed since Thomas Mitchell stepped onto that westbound train in Millbrook, carrying his father's engineering notebooks and William Harrison's promise of opportunity. The young man who had left as an apprentice engineer returned in the spring of 1924 as the president of the Grand Western Railroad Company, arriving in his own private car to a town that barely recognized the empire he had built from the foundation of his illegitimate birth and his mother's unwavering sacrifice. Eleanor stood on the platform of the Millbrook station, watching as Thomas emerged from the gleaming railroad car that bore the company's distinctive gold and crimson livery. At 59, she remained remarkably vital, her silver hair styled fashionably, and her bearing reflecting the confidence of a woman who had transformed personal tragedy into community achievement. The school she had founded now educated over 200 children, and her various business enterprises had made her one of the most respected figures in the region. Thomas approached his mother with the measured dignity befitting a man who controlled thousands of miles of railroad track and employed tens of thousands of workers across the Western Territories. But when he embraced Eleanor on the station platform, observers saw not the powerful railroad magnate, but a devoted son greeting the woman who had shaped his character through years of sacrifice and dedication. "Mother," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying emotion that 20 years of business negotiations and corporate battles had never quite erased. "I've come home to fulfill a promise I made to myself when I left Millbrook." Eleanor studied her son's face, noting the confidence and authority that success had given him, while recognizing the fundamental decency that remained unchanged from his childhood. "What promise was that?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would surprise her. Thomas gestured toward the assembled crowd that had gathered to witness his return, townspeople who remembered the young man's departure but could hardly comprehend the magnitude of his achievements. "I promised that someday I would return to vindicate your faith in me and to repay the debt I owe to this community for accepting us when we had nowhere else to turn." The vindication Thomas spoke of would unfold over the following weeks in ways that transformed not only Eleanor's personal reputation, but the entire economic foundation of Millbrook. His first act was to announce the construction of a major railroad maintenance facility that would employ over 500 workers and bring unprecedented prosperity to the mill town. But this was merely the beginning of a comprehensive plan that demonstrated how completely Thomas had absorbed his father's vision of railroads serving community development rather than simply extracting profits. The Grand Western Railroad Company, under Thomas's leadership, had become one of the most innovative transportation enterprises in America. Unlike competitors who focused solely on moving freight and passengers as efficiently as possible, Thomas had developed a business model that emphasized long-term partnership with the communities his railroad served. This approach had proven remarkably profitable while creating sustainable economic development that benefited everyone involved. Thomas's success had not come easily or without cost. The early years of his railroad career had indeed presented the social challenges Eleanor had feared, with some colleagues and competitors questioning his legitimacy and worthiness based on his irregular birth. But Thomas had met these challenges with the dignity and competence his mother had instilled in him, proving himself through superior performance rather than defensive explanations. William Harrison had provided crucial support during Thomas's most difficult early experiences, but he had been careful to avoid creating dependency or the appearance of unmerited favoritism. Thomas had earned each promotion through demonstrated ability, working longer hours and accepting greater risks than his more conventionally credentialed peers. By the time he assumed leadership of the company following William's retirement, his reputation was built on solid professional achievements rather than personal connections. The railroad empire Thomas now controlled stretched from Chicago to the Pacific coast, with branch lines serving dozens of growing communities throughout the Western Territories. His innovations in railroad technology and community development had attracted attention from business leaders and government officials who sought to understand and replicate his methods. Several universities had awarded him honorary degrees in recognition of his contributions to transportation engineering and regional economic development. But Thomas's greatest achievement, in Eleanor's opinion, was not his financial success or professional recognition, but the character he had maintained throughout his rise to prominence. The values she had worked to instill during his childhood had survived the corrupting influences of wealth and power, leaving him generous with his success while remaining grounded in principles of fairness and service to others. The announcement of the railroad maintenance facility was followed by even more ambitious plans that revealed the scope of Thomas's vision for Millbrook's future. The Grand Western Railroad Company would establish its eastern headquarters in the town, bringing dozens of well-paid administrative positions and creating a regional center for railroad operations. Additionally, Thomas announced plans for a technical college that would train the next generation of railroad engineers and mechanics, ensuring a steady supply of skilled workers while providing educational opportunities for local young people. These developments represented millions of dollars in investment and hundreds of permanent jobs, transforming Millbrook from a struggling mill town into a thriving regional center. But Thomas made clear that his commitment to the community extended beyond mere economic development to address social and cultural needs that other business leaders might ignore. The technical college would be open to students regardless of their family background or financial circumstances, with scholarship programs ensuring that talent rather than wealth determined admission. Thomas had experienced firsthand the barriers that social prejudice could create for capable individuals, and he was determined to create opportunities based on merit rather than inherited advantage. Eleanor attended the groundbreaking ceremony for the railroad headquarters building, watching with pride as Thomas addressed a crowd that included local officials, business leaders, and hundreds of townspeople whose lives would be transformed by his investments. His speech combined practical explanations of the economic benefits his projects would bring with broader reflections on the values that had guided his business philosophy. Success without purpose is merely accumulation, Thomas told the assembled crowd. The railroad industry has prospered by connecting communities and creating opportunities for people to improve their circumstances through honest work and fair dealing. The investments we're making in Millbrook reflect our belief that business enterprises should contribute to the communities they serve rather than simply extracting value from them. Eleanor recognized in Thomas's words the influence of lessons she had tried to teach him during his childhood, combined with insights he had gained through years of professional experience. The boy who had asked questions about fairness and justice had become a man who used his position to implement practical solutions to social and economic challenges. The transformation of Millbrook attracted national attention as journalists and business analysts sought to understand Thomas's approach to railroad management and community development. Articles in major newspapers and business publications described the Millbrook model as an innovative alternative to the exploitative practices common among industrial corporations. Thomas found himself invited to speak at universities and business conferences, sharing his methods with other leaders who were beginning to recognize the long-term advantages of sustainable community partnership. But for all his public success and professional recognition, Thomas remained most concerned with his personal relationship with Eleanor and his ability to honor the sacrifice she had made on his behalf. Their private conversations during his extended stay in Millbrook revealed the depth of gratitude he felt for her courage in protecting his legitimacy while raising him to understand the value of integrity over social acceptance. "I understand now what you endured during those early years," Thomas told Eleanor one evening as they walked through the rose garden she had cultivated behind her home. "The social isolation, the financial uncertainty, the constant worry about providing for my future while maintaining your own dignity. I can never fully repay such sacrifice, but I hope my success provides some vindication for the choices you made." Eleanor smiled at her son's earnest attempt to quantify sacrifices that had been motivated by love rather than expectation of return. "Thomas," she replied gently, "watching you develop into the man you've become has been reward enough for any hardships we face together. The fact that you've used your success to benefit others rather than simply accumulating wealth for yourself proves that the values we tried to live by have taken root in your character." The conversation continued as they discussed Thomas's plans for expanding his community development initiatives to other railroad towns throughout the Grand Western system. His success in Millbrook had demonstrated the viability of his approach, encouraging him to implement similar programs in dozens of other communities that would benefit from sustained investment and partnership rather than simple commercial exploitation. Thomas had also been working quietly to address another aspect of his family history that had remained unresolved for nearly 4 decades. Through careful investigation and discreet inquiries, he had located Eleanor's parents in Cedar Falls, learning that both Thomas and Margaret Whitmore were still alive, though now quite elderly. The grandparents, who had never known of Thomas's existence, were living in reduced circumstances, their bookshop having failed years earlier due to changing economic conditions and their advancing age. "I would like to contact them," Thomas told Eleanor during one of their evening conversations, "not to create guilt or demand recognition, but to offer assistance in their old age, and perhaps to heal wounds that have divided our family for too long." Eleanor felt complex emotions at the prospect of contact with her parents after nearly 40 years of separation. The pain of their rejection remained real despite the passage of time. But she also recognized that they had acted according to the moral standards of their era and community. The success Thomas had achieved might provide a foundation for reconciliation that could benefit everyone involved. "What would you say to them?" Eleanor asked, curious about how Thomas would approach grandparents who had never acknowledged his existence. Thomas had clearly given considerable thought to this question. "I would tell them that their daughter raised a son who honored the values they tried to instill in her, despite the difficult circumstances that led to our separation. I would express gratitude for the education and moral foundation they provided, which enabled you to raise me with similar principles, and I would offer to help them in their old age, not as charity, but as family obligation." The letter Thomas eventually sent to his grandparents was a masterpiece of diplomacy and respect, acknowledging the pain of their long separation while focusing on possibilities for renewed relationship rather than past grievances. He enclosed photographs showing Eleanor's success in Millbrook and documentation of his own achievements, providing evidence that their exile had ultimately led to positive outcomes for both mother and son. The response came more quickly than either Eleanor or Thomas had anticipated. Margaret Whitmore, now 82 and widowed following her husband's death 2 years earlier, wrote with trembling handwriting to express her amazement at learning about her grandson's existence and success. Her letter was filled with regret for the long separation and eager desire to establish contact with the family she had lost through pride and rigid adherence to social conventions. "I have thought of Eleanor every day for 40 years, Margaret wrote, wondering what became of my only child and regretting the harsh judgment that drove her away. To learn that she not only survived but prospered, and that she raised such a remarkable son, fills me with gratitude and shame in equal measure. If there is any possibility of reconciliation after so many years, I would welcome it more than I can express." Eleanor wept when she read her mother's letter, feeling decades of suppressed pain and longing finally acknowledged and validated. Thomas arranged for his grandmother to travel to Millbrook, providing a private railroad car and medical attendant to ensure her comfort during the journey that would reunite a family divided by circumstances and pride. The meeting between Eleanor and her mother took place in the same rose garden where Eleanor had shared so many important conversations with Thomas over the years. Margaret Whitmore, now frail with age, but still possessing the dignified bearing Eleanor remembered from childhood, embraced her daughter with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered repeatedly as she held Eleanor close. "I'm so sorry for the pain we caused you, for the years we lost, for not trusting in your character and judgment." "Bye." Eleanor felt her own tears flowing freely as she absorbed her mother's apology and the validation it represented. "You acted according to your understanding of what was right," she replied gently. "I never stopped loving you, even when I couldn't. Forgive the hurt." Thomas observed the reunion from a respectful distance, understanding that this moment belonged primarily to the women whose relationship had been fractured by his conception and birth. But when Eleanor beckoned him forward to meet his grandmother, he approached with the same dignity and respect he had shown throughout his life. Margaret studied Thomas's features intently, seeing in his face the same intelligence and strength of character that had marked both his parents. "You look like your father," she said finally, having heard the full story of Eleanor's relationship with James Mitchell. "But you have your mother's eyes, and I suspect you have her stubborn determination as well." Thomas smiled at his grandmother's assessment, appreciating her direct manner and evident wisdom despite the prejudices that had caused such pain years earlier. "I hope I've inherited the best qualities of both parents," he replied. "Mother raised me to value integrity and service to others, principles I believe would have made my father proud as well." The reconciliation between Eleanor and her mother provided a sense of completion to family relationships that had been damaged by circumstances beyond anyone's complete control. Margaret spent several weeks in Millbrook, marveling at the community Eleanor had helped to build and the success Thomas had achieved despite the irregular circumstances of his birth. During her visit, Margaret also had the opportunity to see the school Eleanor had founded and the various business enterprises she had developed over the years. The evidence of her daughter's accomplishments provided powerful testimony to the strength and wisdom Eleanor had demonstrated in navigating challenges that had initially seemed insurmountable. "You've built something remarkable here," Margaret told Eleanor as they toured the expanded school facilities that now served children from throughout the region. "Not just the buildings and programs, but a community that values education and opportunity over prejudice and narrow thinking. Your father would have been so proud of what you've accomplished." As summer drew to a close and Thomas prepared to return to his business responsibilities in the Western Territories, the transformation of Millbrook was well underway. Construction crews were already breaking ground for the railroad maintenance facility, while architects worked to finalize plans for the technical college and headquarters building. The economic impact was already visible in new shops and services opening to serve the influx of workers and their families. But the most significant transformation was not economic but social. The story of Eleanor's sacrifice and Thomas's success had become a powerful example of how character and determination could overcome social prejudice and create opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than inherited advantage. Young people throughout the region were inspired by Thomas's example to pursue their own ambitious goals, regardless of their family background or social circumstances. Eleanor stood once again on the Millbrook train platform, this time watching as Thomas prepared to depart for business responsibilities that would take him across the continent. But unlike his departure 20 years earlier, this farewell carried no uncertainty about his future success or their continued relationship. Thomas had established permanent connections to Millbrook that would bring him home regularly, while Eleanor had gained recognition as one of the most respected women in the region. "Thank you," Thomas said simply as he embraced his mother for the final time before boarding his private car. "Thank you for believing in possibilities when everyone else saw only scandal. Thank you for protecting my future when you could have chosen easier paths. Thank you for teaching me that character matters more than circumstances." Eleanor watched as the train carried her son toward his next business adventure, feeling a sense of completion and vindication that made all the years of struggle and sacrifice worthwhile. The frightened young woman who had left Cedar Falls in disgrace had become a respected community leader, whose son now controlled one of America's largest railroad companies. Her decision to protect James Mitchell's reputation by bearing their child alone had ultimately created opportunities and achievements that neither of them could have imagined. The roses in Eleanor's garden bloomed more beautifully that autumn than ever before, as if nature itself was celebrating the vindication of faith and the triumph of love over adversity. Eleanor tended them with the same careful attention she had devoted to raising Thomas, understanding that both achievements required patience, dedication, and unwavering belief in the possibility of growth and transformation. Visitors to Millbrook, in the years that followed, would often comment on the unusual prosperity and harmony that characterized the community. The railroad facilities and technical college that Thomas had established created sustainable economic growth, while the values Eleanor had embodied in her school and community leadership fostered an atmosphere of opportunity and mutual respect that attracted families and businesses from throughout the region. Eleanor lived to see her grandson graduate from the technical college his father had founded, carrying forward another generation of the Mitchell family legacy in railroad engineering and community development. She also witnessed the completion of a bronze statue in Millbrook Central Square, commissioned by Thomas to honor the women whose courage and sacrifice create possibilities for future generations. The inscription on the statue read simply, "To Eleanor Whitmore Mitchell, whose love transformed exile into opportunity and whose faith created a legacy of service to others." But those who knew the full story understood that the monument represented more than individual achievement. It celebrated the triumph of character over circumstance, the power of love to endure separation and hardship, and the possibility of redemption even when hope seems lost. Eleanor's story became part of Millbrook's official history, taught to students in the school she had founded and cited by business leaders who sought to understand Thomas's innovative approach to corporate responsibility. But for Eleanor herself, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that her sacrifice had not been in vain, that her son had honored his father's memory while creating his own lasting contribution to the communities they served. The woman who had been cast out for refusing to name her baby's father had lived to see that baby become one of America's most successful and respected business leaders, returning to transform the community that had sheltered them during their most vulnerable years. Her vindication was complete, not because society had finally accepted her choices, but because those choices had produced results that made acceptance irrelevant. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.